So why did they need to pick up Eric Garner that day? I mean, was it specifically Eric Garner, or they need to get somebody out there, or was it just like this guy was, indicative, or they perceived him as a linchpin that, as they wanted to try and, I guess, contract, the spread of Tompkinsville or some way?
So the official explanation that the police gave is that a lieutenant drove by the park earlier that morning, saw something that bothered him, and then told these two knuckleheads, Panaleo and D'Amico, who were sort of like young detectives, to go back to the park and do what they said. The quote was to address specific conditions. Now, what I heard was that he had seen Garner standing on a street corner, and everybody knew who Garner was. I mean, the cops were very familiar with him. They had a run-in with him just a week before. One of the things they do, and again, if you've watched The Wire, you're familiar with this process. They do these daily CompStat meetings where police commanders are brought to Lower Manhattan, and they're shown pictures of their own neighborhoods, and the higher ups in the police department will tell them, look at how bad your neighborhood looks. I want you to clean this up. And the word was that somebody in Manhattan was upset at the way the Tompkinsville neighborhood looked, and so everything rolls downhill. A lieutenant got the word from a higher up in the Staten Island precinct that they wanted that block cleaned up, and so he tells these two detectives to go to the park, and they probably, I mean, I can't say this for sure, but they probably told him specifically to pick up Garner. And what I heard from other police officers was that, when you're told something like this by your superior, you can't just tell the guy, yeah, I moved him around a corner. You have to show him a piece of paper with a number on it, because that's how the department works. Everything is about stats in New York. And you need to show them that you made an arrest. And so if you watch the video, you can see that these two dynamics at play. On the one hand, Garner is incredulous because he knows he hasn't done anything. And on the other hand, these two cops don't seem to feel like they have any other option but to get him into a car. And that's how this crazy, ridiculous, horrible, outcome happens.
And because Garner's such a big guy and not terribly well dressed, he's the low hanging fruit when it comes to showing that you can make an arrest and sort of make the park just physically look better in some way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think if you had an obese white guy who was maybe dressed a little bit better than Eric Garner, they probably wouldn't have gone out of their way to pick him up. I mean, if you've been to the park, there are people in the park who are every single day who are clear out and out addicts and alcoholics and troublemakers. Eric Garner, on the other hand, he's just big and didn't dress particularly well. I mean, he was never one of these people who was creating problems, and he wasn't somebody that you'd be afraid of if you lived in that neighborhood. In fact, kind of the opposite. Most of the store owners I talked to liked him. It was just the fact that he was so visible, and he was just an easy person to pick up.
So tell us about David Pantaleo. This is the cop that gave him the chokehold, killed him.
Right.
And the story of Dan Donovan, who was at that time the Staten Island DA. Because this is part of the story too, right? I mean, there's everything up to the point of contact and killing Eric Garner is one part of the story, and then sort of the complete lack of accountability is the other part of the story.
Yeah, and I personally think that this side of the story is the one that's the more troubling and the scarier part of the story, because the incidents that happen on the street tend to take place between cops who are, let's face it, if you've done ride-alongs with cops, if you've spent any time with police officers who have especially like patrol jobs, it's a lousy job, it's a dangerous job, it's a tense job, and you get into a lot of arguments with people who emotions are running high all the time. And so the worst abuse cases tend to happen after some kind of split-second something goes very, very wrong. And that's terrible. There's no question about it. I mean, especially because a lot of them involve people who have a history of that kind of making bad split-second decisions. But the more sinister thing to me is that there's a whole bureaucracy built up designed to make these things go away quietly and to perpetuate the problem. And in the case of, one of the reasons I picked this story to write a book about is because it was so textbook in terms of being an example of why these cases recur so often. All the same things that happen in almost all the worst abuse cases were present in this case. You had the police department that had a problem cop that didn't take him off the force because A, the mechanism for that is broken, B, the information about problem cops is not public and cannot be made public, and then C, there's like a million tricks they use to prevent there from being any punishment when a police officer goes over the line and uses excessive force. In this case, the mechanism was a grand jury that was probably used to put on a defense case instead of a prosecution case. And I found numerous cases that were exactly like this, dating back 50 and 60 years, where instead of taking a couple of days and showing the video to get an indictment from the grand jury, they took months and months and months to present evidence. And at the end of it, the grand jury decided not to indict, and
right.
that's how they avoid it.
And the DAs use this as a way of avoiding accountability for this too, right?
Absolutely, it's perfect for the DAs because they have to work with the police. I mean, that's why the argument that DAs should never be put in the position of having to prosecute cops is so compelling, because they have a built-in institutional incentive to not do that because they're partners with them, essentially. I mean, they're working together constantly to try to put people away. So when they're put in the position of having to prosecute a case, it's very, very difficult for prosecutors to do this and politically come out in a way that isn't damaged, because if they do the right thing and go after a problem cop who's maybe done something like what happened in the Garner case and used a chokehold and killed somebody, then you're going to have problems with the police, working with the police forever. So the grand jury is the ideal solution. It's, hey, we held this lengthy investigation that went on months, and we presented all these witnesses, and the people decided not to indict, not us, right? So it's not our problem. But the odd thing about that is that if you watch the DAs after grand juries make these decisions, they're all saying things like, they never express disappointment that they don't get an indictment,
right.
Which is so weird because that's what they're there to do.
Right. They just spent months presenting evidence. Ostensibly, that was what their agenda was. I mean, so
right.
Is there? I mean, and we saw this. I think was St. Louis. I think this was specifically that Ferguson. Ferguson was the exact same situation where it's like, you don't need the grand jury. You don't need, the video seems to me to be fairly straightforward in terms of evidence. You don't need all that, but it is it's sort of like a short circuit. Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos